For section 3.1, we're going to look at graphing, and we're going to review graphing from a T-chart and also graphing from standard form. We're also going to spend a little bit of time on vertical and horizontal lines. In the past, you've learned 3 different ways to graph lines, and you've learned all these in your previous classes. So you've learned how to graph using a T-chart, you've learned how to graph from standard form, you learned that in Algebra 2, and you've learned how to graph from slope-intercept form, or y equals mx plus b. You learned this back in Algebra 1. In college algebra, we review all 3 of these. You're tested on all 3 of these. In this particular section, we're going to be focusing on graphing from a T-chart and graphing from standard form. Graphing from slope-intercept form we'll get to in a couple sections. For our first graph, I'm going to be reminding you guys how to graph from a T-chart. When you use a T-chart to graph, basically what you do is you create this XY grid and you choose points to plug in. Now let me tell you when to use a T-chart. You can actually use a T-chart anytime you want. It doesn't matter what this function up here looks like. This function can look in standard form, it can look like it's in slope-intercept form, it can be quadratic or cubic or linear, it doesn't matter. A T-chart will always work. T-charts are kind of our fallback method of graphing. Oh my gosh, I forgot how to graph from slope-intercept. Quick, get a T-chart, and it'll work every time. Now when you graph from a T-chart, I'm always going to require 3 points, so keep that in mind. Now I don't care what 3 points you choose. You can actually choose any 3 points that you want. For example, I might choose the point -2 for x, I might choose the point 1 for y, I might choose the point 4 for x. Remember, it doesn't matter what points you choose, it doesn't matter whether you choose points on the x side or the y side. Whatever points you choose, you're going to plug into that function and you're going to be able to graph your line. So I chose -2, 4, and 1. So let's start with our -2. Since I want to know if x is -2, I'm going to come up in this function. I'm going to plug that -2 in for x. Now remember, what does f of x equal? F of x is the same thing as y, so don't let that confuse you. That just means y. If I plug in a -2, I get a +6 plus 1, or a 7. So down here in my chart, I've got -2, +7, which means I can go over here in my graph and graph the point -2, 7. For my second point, I've actually plugged my second point in for y. So instead of y is f of x, I'm going to plug in a 1 for y. So instead of f of x equals, it's going to be 1 equals. Remember, f of x and y are the same thing. I'm going to minus that 1 over and get a 0. I'm going to divide by that -3 and get a 0. So I know that I've got a point at 0, 1 on this graph. Last but not least, I'm going to use that 4, and once again, that 4 is in the x column, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug that 4 in for x. So -3 times 4 plus 1. Well, -3 times 4 is -12. -12 plus 1 happens to be -11, giving me a point at 4, -11, which is right about here on my graph. So these are my 3 points. Now once you've got your 3 points, you're ready to go ahead and graph your line. I've got some stipulations for that. When you graph your line, first of all, I want it to be a straight line. So I need you to use a straight edge, okay? You can use your ID, you can use your driver's license, you can use pretty much whatever you want, but I want you to use a straight edge and make that line really straight. I also want that line to go all the way through the graph. Make it go all the way through the graph. So in essence, what you've done is you've taken this function and you've put it in graph form. Remember, these are the same thing. One's just written in function form, one is just written in graphical form. For our second method of graphing, I want to look at graphing from standard form. Now you learned how to graph from standard form in Algebra 2. The most important thing is when you want to graph from standard form, you have to make sure your function looks a certain way. It's really important that you check your function first. You cannot graph from standard form unless the function is in standard form. What does that mean? That means the x and y need to be together on one side of the equation, and you need a constant or a number on the other side of the equation. So the x and y's need to be together over here, the constant needs to be by itself over here. Now when you graph from standard form, you create a T-chart, but it's a specific looking T-chart. When you graph from standard form, you always want to plug in a 0 for x, and you always want to plug in a 0 for y. This is why a lot of students like standard form. It only requires 2 points. You don't have to have 3 like we did in the last T-chart. If I plug a 0 in for x, it's 2 times 0 minus y equals 4. Well, that x completely cancels itself out and gets me y is -4. What did I just do? I just intentionally canceled the x and found my y-intercept, which in this case is 0, -4. For my second point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug a 0 in for y now. So instead of plugging it in for x, I'm actually going to plug it in for 0. And what's going to happen is I'm intentionally going to cancel that y and solve for my x-intercept. In this case, my x-intercept happens to be positive 2, 0. So once you've got your x and y intercepts, all you have to do now is graph your line. Now remember, I've got specific requirements for graphing those lines. I want them to be straight, I want you to use a straight edge, whatever you need to do to create a nice straight line through those points. And that's how to graph from standard. Now let's take a minute and remind ourselves of horizontal and vertical lines. Anytime your equation is y equals and you notice that the x is gone, you know you've got a horizontal or vertical line. So when you look up at your equation and you realize that one of your variables is completely missing, you know it's horizontal or vertical. Now how do you tell which is which? Well, y equals 3 is horizontal. Let me explain where that comes from. If I was to create a t-chart, which eventually you won't need to, y is 3 every single time. No matter what points I choose for x, y is 3, due to this equation being y equals 3. Well, if we go over and graph that, you've got 0, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, on and on and on and on. You could go on forever. And so what that does is it creates a horizontal line through y equals 3. Now remember, the slope of a horizontal line is 0. There is no slope. This is a 0 slope. Now let's take a minute and look at a vertical line. First of all, I know this is either going to be horizontal or vertical due to the fact that when I look at my equation, I notice my y is missing. Remember in the last slide, if you look at the equation and notice that one of your variables is just completely not there, it's either going to be horizontal or vertical. Now the first thing you want to do in this case is get the x by itself. This should be x equals -2. You need to minus that 2 over and get that x by itself. Now this happens to be a vertical line. Let me prove it to you. If I were to create a t-chart for this, x would be -2, -2, -2. No matter what I choose for y, x would be -2 due to this equation. X is -2. No matter what, x is -2. So no matter what I plug in for y, x is -2. So what happens is you go to -2, 0, -2, 1, -2, 2, and you get a vertical line. So it would look something like this. And that's a vertical line. Now remember, the slope of a vertical line is no slope. There is no slope of a vertical line. It's not 0. There is no slope of a vertical line.